The sun hung low on the horizon, a blistering ember smeared across a bruised sky. Somewhere in the valley below, a faint wisp of smoke curled upward, barely visible through the thick haze of pine and cedar that coated the mountainside. High above it all, nestled in the jagged cliffs of the unyielding spine, a dragon lay sprawled in repose. Ethereal scales the color of storm-tossed seas shimmered faintly in the twilight, catching the last vestiges of sunlight as the creature's chest rose and fell in a slow, rhythmic cadence. Orakthur was old, even by draconic standards. His wings bore scars from battles fought centuries ago, and his once lustrous horns were now dulled at the tips, weathered by time. Yet his golden eyes remained sharp, piercing the expanse of the valley below with a gaze that saw far more than mere mortals could perceive. This was a land both ancient and young, its hills and rivers shaped by millennia of erosion yet still teeming with the fragile chaos of human life. It was a contradiction Orakthur had grown to tolerate, if not entirely understand. He had been here for decades now, a self-imposed exile from the world of men and their ceaseless conflicts. The unyielding spine was a sanctuary, untouched, unclaimed, and vast enough for a creature of his size to vanish entirely from mortal sight. It was here that Orakthur had come to rest, to contemplate, and to escape the burdens of a world that no longer seemed to have a place for beings like him. But even in his isolation, the tendrils of humanity's dramas reached him. Today, it came not as a whisper of war or a plea for aid, but as a faint, acrid scent carried on the wind, burning wood and something far darker. Orakthur lifted his head, his nostrils flaring. Beneath the scent of smoke was the unmistakable tang of fear, sharp and bitter, a scent that stirred instincts he thought long buried. He rose slowly, his massive frame casting a long shadow over the rocky ledge as he unfurled his wings and stretched. The air was thick with anticipation, as if the land itself held its breath. Far below, in the clearing where the forest gave way to an open plain, a group of humans had gathered. Orakthur's keen eyes picked out the scene with ease. Men and women, their faces obscured by the flickering light of torches, stood in a tight semicircle. At the center of their gathering was a single, small figure, a child, no more than 11 years of age. Her hands were bound, her head bowed, and her trembling form was barely visible beneath the cascade of her dark hair. Orakthur's gaze sharpened, the golden light in his eyes narrowing to slits. The girl's terror was palpable, even from this distance. He could taste it on the wind, mingling with the acrid bitterness of smoke and the metallic tang of blood. This was no mere gathering. It was a ritual. And rituals in the human world rarely ended well for their victims. The dragon shifted his weight, his talons scraping against the stone. He could hear faint voices now, carried upward by the currents of air. They were indistinct, but their tone was unmistakable. Anger, desperation, and something else, something dark and primal. The humans had the look of villagers, their clothes simple and worn, their faces etched with lines of hardship. Yet there was no mistaking the weapons they carried: rusted swords, pitchforks, and heavy wooden clubs. Tools of labor turned to instruments of violence. Orakthur's tail flicked, a low growl rumbling in his throat. He had seen this before, the mob's lust for vengeance, the scapegoating of the innocent. Humanity, for all its ingenuity and resilience, had a terrible tendency to devour its own when fear took hold. And here, in this desolate corner of the world, it seemed that cycle was repeating itself. He lowered his head, his eyes narrowing as he studied the girl. She was young, painfully so, her small frame dwarfed by the crude stake she was tied to. Her clothes were simple but dirted, and her bare feet were caked with mud. Yet there was a defiance in her posture, a quiet strength that belied her fear. Even as the crowd jeered and brandished their weapons, she did not cry out. Instead, she lifted her head, her dark eyes scanning the crowd with an intensity that seemed almost otherworldly. Orakthur felt a flicker of something stir within him, an ember of emotion he had not felt in centuries. It was not pity, nor was it anger. It was something far older, something buried deep within the core of his being. He had lived through countless ages, witnessed the rise and fall of empires, and yet this single moment, this fragile, defiant child standing alone against a sea of hatred, felt more significant than any he could recall. The wind shifted again, and with it came the faint melodic sound of the girl's voice. She was singing, her words soft and lilting, a stark contrast to the harsh shouts of the mob. It was a song Orakthur did not recognize, its melody haunting and mournful, yet filled with an unyielding sense of hope. The sound pierced through the noise, rising above the chaos like a beacon of light in the darkness. And then, as if in response to her song, the first torch was thrown. Flames erupted at the base of the stake, licking hungrily at the dry wood. The girl's song faltered, her voice breaking as the heat surged around her. The crowd roared, their cries a cacophony of rage and triumph. Yet even as the fire climbed higher, the girl did not scream. She stood silent, her eyes locked on the horizon, as if she were searching for something or someone. Orakthur rose to his full height, his wings unfurling with a sound like rolling thunder. The air around him shimmered with heat as his scales caught the dying light, casting brilliant reflections across the mountainside. He had sworn an oath long ago to remain apart from the affairs of men, to let their world unfold as it would without his interference. But oaths, like the hearts that made them, could be broken. With a single powerful leap, the dragon launched himself into the sky. The wind roared in his ears as he descended toward the valley, his massive form cutting through the twilight like a falling star. Below, the mob's cries faltered as they turned their faces upward, their torches casting long shadows across the clearing. And as Orakthur plunged toward the earth, a single thought burned brightly in his mind. Not tonight. The dragon's descent was both beautiful and terrifying. Orakthur moved through the air with a grace that belied his massive size, each beat of his wings sending tremors through the atmosphere. Below, the mob scattered like ants beneath the shadow of an approaching storm. Torches fell to the ground, their flames snuffed out by the wind stirred by Orakthur's approach. Cries of fear replaced the jeers of anger, and in that moment the balance of power shifted entirely. The girl at the stake, her face pale and streaked with soot, watched the sky with wide, unblinking eyes. Her song had long since ceased, but the memory of its haunting melody lingered in the air. She did not flinch as the dragon landed, the earth quaking beneath the force of his impact. Dust and ash swirled around him, obscuring his massive form for a heartbeat before the wind swept it away. Orakthur's eyes burned like molten gold as he surveyed the scene, his gaze settling on the child. Her gaze met his, and for an instant an unspoken understanding passed between them. She was not afraid, not of him at least. And in her defiance, Orakthur saw a glimmer of something he had not encountered in centuries, a kindred spirit. The crowd, however, was another matter. They stood frozen, torn between fight and flight, their primitive weapons trembling in their hands. One man, braver, or perhaps more foolish than the others, stepped forward. His face was a mask of fury, his knuckles white as they gripped a rusted sword. "Demon," the man bellowed, his voice cracking with desperation. "You will not take her. She's cursed. A blight on our village." Orakthur's head tilted slightly, his golden eyes narrowing. The word demon was not new to him. Humanity had long sought to name what they could not understand. But it was the accusation that followed, the declaration of blame and guilt, that stirred a deep, simmering anger within him. He had lived through ages where fear bred cruelty, where the weak were sacrificed to sate the insecurities of the many. And yet, for all his years, he had never grown accustomed to it. "You speak of blight," Orakthur rumbled, his voice a low, resonant growl that seemed to shake the very ground. "And yet it is you who would destroy the innocent to protect your own fragility. Tell me, mortal, what corruption truly festers here?" The man faltered, his sword lowering slightly as doubt flickered across his face. But others in the crowd found their courage, their voices rising in a cacophony of fear and justification. "She brought the sickness. The crops failed because of her. She's not natural." Orakthur's tail lashed against the ground, the sound reverberating like a thunderclap. The noise silenced the mob instantly, their cries replaced by a tense, oppressive quiet. The dragon leaned forward, his massive head lowering until his gaze was level with the crowd. The heat radiating from his body was palpable, a reminder of the inferno he could unleash with but a single breath. "You are quick to assign blame," he said, his tone measured but laced with menace. "Quicker still to punish without understanding. Do you not see what you have become? Fear has turned you into the very monsters you claim to fight." For a moment, the mob hesitated, their resolve wavering. But fear is a powerful force, and it only takes one voice to reignite its flames. From the back of the crowd, an older woman stepped forward, her face lined with age and grief. Her hands clutched a talisman, a crude wooden carving of a figure with wings. "My son is dead because of her," the woman said, her voice trembling with emotion. "We've lost too much. You can't understand our pain, beast. You're not one of us." Orakthur's eyes softened briefly as he regarded the woman. Her pain was genuine, her grief a wound that would not heal easily. But grief, he knew, could twist even the kindest hearts into instruments of destruction. "Your pain blinds you," he said gently, his voice softer now but no less commanding. "And in your blindness you seek to harm that which you do not understand. Tell me, what proof do you have of this child's guilt?" The woman faltered, her grip on the talisman tightening. "She was found in the woods," she whispered. "Alone, where no child should be. Strange things happen when she's near. The crops wither, the animals grow sick. We can't ignore it." Orakthur's gaze shifted back to the girl. She stood silently, her expression unreadable, but her eyes glimmered with unshed tears. She did not defend herself. Perhaps she knew it would make no difference. Or perhaps she had simply grown tired of trying. "And yet," Orakthur said, his voice rising once more, "you have no proof. You cast judgment based on fear and coincidence. Is this the justice you would want for your own children?" The crowd murmured uneasily, the weight of the dragon's words sinking in. Some lowered their weapons, their faces etched with doubt. Others clung to their fear, their grip tightening on their makeshift arms. The woman with the talisman looked away, her expression torn between anger and shame. Orakthur exhaled deeply, the warm air washing over the clearing like a summer breeze. He had seen enough to know that words alone would not sway all of them. But he had planted a seed, a doubt that would grow in the hearts of those willing to listen. Turning his attention back to the girl, Orakthur stretched his wings wide, casting a shadow that enveloped her entirely. "I will not allow this," he declared, his voice echoing across the valley. "If you seek to harm her, you will answer to me." The mob recoiled, their fear now directed solely at the dragon. For a moment it seemed as though they might challenge him, but the weight of his presence was too much. One by one, they began to retreat, their torches abandoned and their heads bowed. The woman with the talisman lingered the longest, her eyes filled with a sorrow that went deeper than words. Finally, she too turned and walked away, her talisman dangling loosely in her hand. As the last of the villagers disappeared into the trees, Orakthur turned back to the girl. She stared up at him, her expression a mixture of awe and confusion. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, The dragon lowered his massive head, his golden eyes meeting hers once more. "You are safe now," he said softly. "But your journey is far from over." The forest wrapped them in an uneasy silence, broken only by the distant rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a night bird. The fire that had once threatened the girl's life had long since smoldered into ash, leaving a faint, acrid scent in the air. Orakthur stood like a sentinel, his massive form outlined against the pale light of the rising moon. The girl remained at the base of the charred stake, her bound hands trembling as the last vestiges of adrenaline left her body. "Come closer," Orakthur said gently, his voice carrying a low, melodic hum that seemed to resonate with the earth itself. The girl hesitated, her wide eyes flicking to the empty clearing where the mob had stood just moments ago. Her fear was palpable, but so too was her resolve. With a tentative step, she moved forward, the tattered hem of her dress brushing against the dirt. When she was close enough for Orakthur to see the details of her soot-streaked face, the dragon lowered his head, his golden eyes scanning her as though searching for something unseen. "What is your name, child?" he asked, his tone soft but commanding. "Ilara," she whispered, her voice hoarse. She swallowed hard, her throat dry from smoke and fear. "My name is Ilara." Orakthur nodded, a faint rumble of approval escaping his chest. "Ilara. A name strong and unyielding, like the mountains." He tilted his head, his gaze narrowing slightly. "Tell me, Ilara, why do they hate you?" The girl's lips pressed together in a thin line, her eyes dropping to the ground. For a moment she seemed lost in thought, her small hands tugging absently at the frayed rope that bound her wrists. Then, with a deep breath, she looked up, meeting the dragon's gaze with a defiance that seemed to surprise even herself. "They think I'm cursed," she said, her voice steady now despite the tremor in her hands. "Strange things happen when I'm around. The crops fail. The animals, they get sick. People whisper that it's my fault, that I bring misfortune. But I don't know why. I don't even know if it's true." Orakthur considered her words carefully, his eyes glinting with an ancient wisdom. "Fear is a powerful force," he said. "It drives humans to seek answers, even when none exist. And in their search, they often create monsters where there are none." Ilara's shoulders sagged, the weight of his words settling over her like a heavy cloak. "I didn't ask for this," she murmured, her voice breaking. "I just want to live like everyone else. But no matter where I go, it's always the same. They see me, and they want me gone." The dragon's gaze softened, a rare flicker of compassion crossing his ancient features. "And yet you endure," he said. "You stood tall even as the flames rose around you. There is strength in you, Ilara, though you may not yet see it." Ilara's eyes glistened with tears, but she did not let them fall. Instead, she straightened her back, drawing on a reservoir of courage she hadn't known she possessed. "What will you do with me?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear that lingered in her eyes. Orakthur huffed softly, a sound that was neither a laugh nor a sigh. "I will not harm you, if that is your concern. But I cannot leave you here. The mob may have scattered, but their hatred remains. They will return, and when they do, they will not hesitate to finish what they started." Ilara's brow furrowed, her small hands clenching into fists. "Then what choice do I have? Run? Hide? I've done that before, and it never works. They always find me." "Then you must do something different," Orakthur said. He shifted his massive frame, his tail curling around him like a protective barrier. "You must confront what lies within you. Whatever power stirs beneath the surface, it is yours to command. But first, you must understand it." Ilara blinked, confusion mingling with fear. "Power? What do you mean?" The dragon's eyes gleamed with a knowing light. "There is more to you than meets the eye, Elara. The world sees a child, fragile and alone. But I see the threads of something far greater, woven into your very being. It is why they fear you, even if they cannot name it." Elara shook her head, her expression a mixture of disbelief and frustration. "I don't understand. If I have this power, then why can't I stop them? Why can't I make them see that I'm not their enemy?" "Because power without understanding is like fire without purpose," Orakthur said. "It burns indiscriminately, destroying all in its path. You must learn to shape it, to direct it. Only then will you find the strength to stand against those who would harm you." Elara's hands relaxed, her gaze dropping to the ground once more. The weight of the dragon's words settled over her, heavy but not unbearable. For the first time, she felt the faintest flicker of hope, a fragile, tenuous thing, but enough to keep her standing. "How?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How do I learn to control it?" Orakthur's wings unfurled slightly, the movement stirring a gentle breeze that rustled the leaves around them. "You will come with me," he said. "The journey will not be easy, and the answers you seek may not be the ones you wish to find. But if you are willing, I will guide you." Elara looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. She hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "I'll come," she said, her voice steady. "I don't know what lies ahead, but I can't stay here. I want to understand." Orakthur nodded, a faint smile playing across his lips. "Then let us leave this place," he said, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "Your path begins now, Elara, and though it will be fraught with challenges, you will not walk it alone." With a single powerful motion, the dragon lowered his body, allowing Elara to climb onto his back. As she settled herself between the ridges of his spine, Orakthur spread his wings wide, their span casting a shadow that seemed to stretch for miles. The air hummed with energy as he leapt into the sky, carrying them both into the unknown. The mountains rose like jagged teeth on the horizon, their peaks crowned with ice that glimmered faintly in the morning sun. The wind was sharper here, carrying the chill of high altitudes and the faint metallic tang of something ancient and untamed. Orakthur's powerful wings beat steadily as he soared toward the distant range, his shadow rippling over the rugged terrain below. Elara clung tightly to the ridges of his back, her fingers numb from the cold but her resolve as unyielding as the stone cliffs ahead. They landed in a narrow valley nestled between two peaks, the ground strewn with rocks and patches of stubborn grass. Orakthur folded his wings with a rustle and crouched low, allowing Elara to slide off. Her legs wobbled as they touched the ground, unused to the strain of flight, but she steadied herself quickly, her eyes darting around the unfamiliar landscape. "Where are we?" she asked, her breath forming pale clouds in the frigid air. "This is the Vale of Whispers," Orakthur replied, his voice low and reverent. "A place steeped in old magic, where the veil between worlds is thin. It is here that your journey must truly begin." Elara frowned, hugging her arms to her chest for warmth. "What do you mean? What am I supposed to do here?" The dragon's golden eyes glimmered with a strange intensity. "The power within you is not something I can simply teach you to wield. It must be uncovered, tested, and tempered. This valley will offer your first trial. Listen closely, for the whispers will guide you." Before Elara could respond, a sudden gust of wind swept through the valley, carrying with it faint, haunting voices. She froze, her eyes widening as she turned in a slow circle, trying to locate the source. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, their tones shifting from mournful to urgent, from soothing to sharp. "What is that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The echoes of those who have come before," Orakthur said. Their spirits linger here, bound to the magic of this place. They will test your heart, your mind, and your will. Do not fear them, but do not take them lightly either." Ilara swallowed hard, her hands clenching into fists. "And what if I fail?" Orakthur's gaze softened, but his voice remained firm. "Failure is not an end, but a lesson. Remember that, and you will not falter." The girl nodded, though her heart pounded in her chest. She took a tentative step forward, then another, the whispers growing louder with each movement. The air around her seemed to thicken, heavy with unseen energy that prickled her skin. She glanced back at Orakther, but the dragon had settled onto his haunches, watching her with an inscrutable expression. "You must walk this path alone," he said. "I cannot interfere." Ilara nodded again and turned away, steeling herself as she ventured deeper into the valley. The terrain grew more uneven, the rocks sharper, as though the land itself sought to challenge her. The whispers swirled around her, forming fragments of words and phrases that tugged at the edges of her mind. "Do you seek truth?" one voice asked, soft and lilting. "Or vengeance?" Another countered, harsher and more insistent. Ilara's steps faltered as the voices grew louder, more distinct. They overlapped and intertwined, forming a chaotic symphony that threatened to overwhelm her. She pressed her hands to her ears, but the whispers only grew more intense, as if they bypassed her senses entirely and spoke directly to her soul. "Stop!" she shouted, her voice cracking. I can't understand you." The voices fell silent all at once, leaving an eerie stillness in their wake. Ilara lowered her hands slowly, her breathing ragged. The silence stretched, heavy and oppressive, until a single voice broke it, clear, calm, and undeniably familiar. "You know why you are here." Ilara's blood ran cold. She turned sharply, her eyes scanning the barren valley, but she saw no one. The voice spoke again, closer now, and she realized with a jolt that it was her own. "You've always known." "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I don't understand. What do you want from me?" The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, the rocks rearranging themselves into a crude, circular pattern. In the center, a small pool of water appeared, its surface impossibly still. Ilara approached cautiously, her reflection rippling as she peered into the depths. For a moment, she saw only her own face, pale and drawn. Then the image changed. She saw her village, the familiar streets and houses bathed in golden sunlight. She saw the faces of the villagers, their expressions a mixture of fear and anger. And she saw herself, standing alone in the center of the square, flames rising around her as the mob shouted for her death. "No," she said again, her voice stronger now. "That's not who I am. That's not all I am." The pool shimmered, the image dissolving into a swirl of light and shadow. A new scene emerged, one she didn't recognize. It showed a vast battlefield, scarred and broken, with figures moving in the distance. At the center stood a figure cloaked in light, their face obscured but their stance unmistakably resolute. Ilara felt a strange pull, as though the figure were calling to her, beckoning her forward. "Who is that?" she asked aloud, her voice trembling. The whispers returned, softer now, their tones blending into a single, harmonious chorus. "It is who you could be, if you choose." Ilara's heart pounded as she stared into the pool. She didn't fully understand what she was seeing, but she knew one thing. She couldn't turn back. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and questions she wasn't sure she could answer. But it was hers to walk. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady. "Show me what I need to do." The pool glowed brightly, and the whispers swelled around her, carrying her resolve into the wind. The first trial had begun. The glow from the pool faded as Elara emerged from the veil of whispers, her body trembling but her mind ablaze. The trial had stripped away illusions and left her with a raw understanding of what lay ahead. The valley had retreated into the distance, and now she stood at the base of a steep, craggy incline. Above her, the darkened sky churned with restless clouds that carried the faint rumble of thunder. Orakthur loomed at her side, his massive form casting a shadow over the narrow path leading upward. "You passed the first trial," he said, his voice a mixture of approval and gravity. "But the whispers are only the beginning. The journey will demand more of you." Elara's fingers brushed the stone pendant at her neck, a fragment of the veil's power that now pulsed faintly against her skin. She looked up at the dragon, her eyes unwavering. "Then let's keep moving," she said. "I didn't come this far to stop now." Orakthur let out a low rumble of approval before turning toward the path ahead. As they climbed, the air grew colder, biting through Elara's thin cloak. The jagged rocks beneath her feet shifted treacherously, but she pressed on, driven by the memory of the visions she had seen. Each step felt like a statement, a defiance against the forces that sought to break her. Halfway up the incline, a distant sound stopped her in her tracks. It was faint at first, a discordant hum that seemed to come from the rocks themselves. As the sound grew louder, Elara's chest tightened. She glanced at Orakthur, who had stopped as well, his golden eyes scanning the surroundings. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the hum. The dragon's pupils narrowed into slits. "An echo," he said, his tone grim. "This place remembers those who came before you. Sometimes those memories take form." Before Elara could respond, the hum rose into a piercing wail. The rocks ahead of them shimmered, and from the air itself, shadowy figures began to emerge. They were translucent, like smoke given shape, and their forms were twisted and fractured. Some bore faint outlines of armor, others carried broken weapons, and all of them moved with a jerking, unnatural gait. "They're people," Elara whispered, her heart pounding. "They were people," Orakthur corrected. "Now they are nothing but echoes, fragments of souls who failed their trials." The shadowy figures turned toward Elara and Orakthur, their hollow eyes glowing faintly. One of them, a tall figure with a shattered helm, stepped forward, raising a rusted sword that disintegrated at its tip. It let out a low, guttural sound that resonated in Elara's chest, a sound that carried equal parts despair and fury. "What do they want?" Elara asked, backing up a step. "They want release," Orakthur said. "But they will not ask for it. They will take it by force." The echoes surged forward, their movements swift and chaotic. Elara's instincts screamed at her to run, but the narrow path offered no escape. Orakthur stepped in front of her, his wings unfurling as he let out a deafening roar that echoed through the mountains. The sound stopped the figures in their tracks, but only for a moment. "Fight them," Orakthur commanded. "But remember, they are more than enemies. They are warnings." Elara's breath came in shallow gasps as she drew the small dagger she carried. It felt pitifully inadequate against the spectral horde, but it was all she had. The first echo lunged at her, its fragmented body moving in disjointed bursts. She dodged to the side and slashed with the dagger, expecting it to pass through harmlessly. To her surprise, the blade met resistance, and the echo recoiled, its form flickering like a dying flame. Encouraged, Elara pressed the attack, her movements clumsy but determined. Each strike against the echoes sent a ripple through her mind, fragments of memories that weren't hers flashing before her eyes. She saw a young man cradling a bloodied child, a woman standing alone against a monstrous foe, a dragon weeping over the ruins of its lair. The memories were overwhelming, but they fueled her resolve. These were lives that had been lost, stories that had been cut short. She wouldn't let her own end the same way. Oracther fought beside her, his claws and tail sweeping through the echoes with devastating force. His movements were precise, almost ritualistic, as if he were performing an ancient dance. Yet even he seemed burdened by the weight of the battle, his roars tinged with sorrow rather than rage. The echoes began to thin, their forms disintegrating one by one. As the last of them fell, the hum in the air dissipated, leaving an uneasy silence. Ilara collapsed to her knees, her body trembling from exhaustion and the lingering echoes of the memories she had glimpsed. Oracther stepped beside her, his scales glinting faintly in the dim light. "You did well," he said softly. "But this was only the second trial. The mountain still holds more secrets." Ilara looked up at him, her eyes blazing with determination despite the tears that streaked her cheeks. "Then we keep climbing," she said, her voice steady. "No matter what it takes." The dragon nodded, his expression inscrutable. Together, they turned toward the path ahead, the peak of the mountain shrouded in storm clouds that crackled with distant lightning. The journey was far from over, but Ilara knew one thing for certain: she would not face it alone. Ilara and Oracther pressed onward, the path narrowing as the wind howled around them. The mountain's peak loomed ahead, veiled in thick storm clouds that pulsed with flickers of violet lightning. Each step felt heavier, as if the mountain itself resisted their approach. Ilara's fingers tightened around the stone pendant at her neck, its pulse mirroring her heartbeat. At last, they reached a jagged plateau, a vast expanse of cracked stone leading to the final threshold, a towering obsidian archway pulsing with an eerie glow. Beyond it, the sky twisted in unnatural spirals, and the air hummed with restrained energy. This was the heart of the mountain, the source of the trials, and the final confrontation. Oracther lowered his head, his golden eyes narrowing. "He is here." A figure stepped through the archway, emerging like a shadow detaching from the darkness. Cloaked in tattered remnants of what had once been regal armor, the being's form wavered between solidity and smoke. Its face was obscured beneath a cracked helm, but the eyes, burning pits of molten gold, fixed upon Ilara with recognition. The dragon's champion at last, the figure intoned, its voice layered with echoes. "You carry their hopes, their defiance. But like the others, you will break." Oracther's wings flared, his form tense. "You are the Forsaken," he rumbled. "The first who sought the mountain's gift and was consumed by its trials." The Forsaken's hollow laughter reverberated through the air. "And now I am its keeper. Bound by failure, fueled by the echoes of those who came after. You will be no different." Ilara stepped forward, her grip firm on the dagger at her side. "I've seen the echoes. I fought their pain. You are not my fate." The Forsaken raised an armored hand, and the storm above roared to life. Bolts of violet lightning struck the ground, shattering stone as the air thickened with swirling shadows. The echoes of past warriors coalesced once more, their fragmented forms writhing in torment, driven to obey their eternal master. Oracther lunged first, unleashing a torrent of golden fire. The flames engulfed the Forsaken, but the spectre merely raised his hand, absorbing the inferno into his own aura. With a swift motion, he retaliated, sending a shock wave of darkness that slammed into the dragon, forcing him back with a growl of pain. Ilara darted forward, weaving between the echoes as they reached for her with spectral hands. She struck out with her dagger, each cut dispersing the phantoms, but they reformed almost instantly. The air pulsed with the weight of their suffering, their voices whispering in her mind. Doubt, fear, failure. She clenched her jaw. No, she was more than the past, more than a lost echo. With a deep breath, she grasped the pendant and held it high. The stone pulsed, its light spreading outward in radiant waves. The echoes hesitated, their forms flickering as if caught between worlds. The Forsaken snarled, his control wavering. Orakthur seized the opening. With a deafening roar, he surged forward, his claws raking through the spectre's chest. The Forsaken staggered, his form unraveling like tattered silk. His molten eyes met Ilara's, a flicker of something, recognition, perhaps regret, shimmering in their depths. "You carry their hopes," he murmured, his voice fading. "Do not squander them." With a final burst of light from the pendant, the Forsaken disintegrated into the wind, his presence dissolving into the very mountain he had once sought to master. The echoes followed, their tormented wails fading into silence. The storm clouds above began to clear, revealing a sky awash with the soft hues of dawn. Ilara fell to her knees, her chest heaving. Orakthur stepped beside her, lowering his massive head until his golden eyes met hers. "It is done," he said quietly. She exhaled slowly, feeling the weight lift from her soul. The trials had tested her, stripped her bare, but she had endured. More than that, she had changed. She had become something greater than she had ever imagined. Rising to her feet, she turned her gaze to the horizon. Below them, the world stretched out vast and unbroken. This was not the end of her journey. It was only the beginning. With the dragon at her side, she took her first step forward.